He was living quietly in the forest, with only his loyal German shepherd by his side. Then a sudden landslide cut off the only water source he relied on for daily survival. With no choice but to search deeper into the trees, he followed his dog, believing they were just looking for another stream. Instead, they found an abandoned research station and a warning that had been buried for 30 years. Before we begin, if you want to know what happens next, take 2 seconds to sign up and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. These stories survive because you're here. The rain had not stopped for days. Mist clung low between the trees, and the forest floor breathed damp earth and broken roots. Daniel Brooks lived in a small wooden cabin tucked deep inside the green wilderness, where moss climbed the logs and the roof sagged slightly under years of weather. At 47, he was tall and lean, his shoulders still squared from a life in the Marines. His face was angular and weathered, framed by medium-length brown hair streaked faintly with gray, always a little unruly, as if the wind never quite left him. Light stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, steady, pale and guarded, belonged to a man who had seen too much and learned to speak too little. PTSD followed him like a second heartbeat. Sleep came in fragments. Thunder could still yank him upright before he remembered he was not in a desert halfway across the world. He lived quietly, trading occasional repair work with distant forest neighbors for canned food, chopping his own firewood, counting batteries before nightfall, as if light itself were rationed. Max, his 6-year-old German shepherd, moved like a shadow at his side. The dog's coat was silver gray along the back and darker at the shoulders, fading to white along the chest and muzzle. Amber eyes watched everything with calm intelligence. Max rarely barked. He observed, waited, and leaned gently against Daniel's knee when storms rolled in. During the worst nights, when thunder cracked open the sky and Daniel's breath turned sharp and shallow, Max would press his warm body against him until the tremor in his hands eased. The dog had been rescued from a failed security training program years ago. Too gentle, they said. Daniel had seen something else, steadiness without aggression. In many ways, Max had become the metronome of Daniel's sanity, a living reminder that the present was not the past. After nearly a week of relentless rain, the hillside upstream gave way. Daniel heard it before he saw it, a low, grinding collapse that rolled through the forest like distant artillery. The next morning, he followed the familiar path to the stream and stopped short. The water no longer ran in its narrow, clear channel. It had shifted, pushing against a bank of exposed roots, carrying with it soil and debris. The current ran cloudy and uneven. When he crouched and dipped his fingers in, the water left a faint metallic scent on his skin. He did not taste it. The stream had been the one constant in his self-imposed exile. It provided drinking water, cooking water, rhythm. When it changed, something inside him shifted too, as if the ground beneath his quiet life had tilted. He waited 3 days. Daniel filtered what little clean water he had stored, stretching it carefully, calculating sips. He told himself the sediment would settle. He told himself the forest would correct itself. But the water remained thick and unreliable, and the smell did not disappear. Each evening, thunder rolled again across the hills, and each time his body reacted before his mind could reason. He hated that reflex most, the betrayal of muscle memory. Max would rise without sound and rest his chin on Daniel's thigh, steady and present. On the 4th morning, Daniel understood what he had avoided admitting. The stream was no longer dependable, and in a life stripped down to essentials, dependency mattered. There was no anger in his decision, only resignation. He packed lightly, canteens, rope, a folding shovel, and set off deeper into the forest, moving cautiously through terrain softened by rain. Daniel walked with the alertness of a trained soldier, scanning tree lines, mapping elevation instinctively. But this was not war. This was survival without violence. Max ranged ahead, nose low, occasionally glancing back as if to confirm Daniel still followed. The forest thickened, old growth rising taller, quieter. Hours passed before Max slowed near a clearing, half swallowed by vines. Through curtains of hanging moss, Daniel saw the outline of a structure, angular, man-made, wrong against the natural curves of the woods. The building was a hydrological research station, its sign long fallen and half buried in leaves. The concrete foundation remained solid, though windows were clouded with grime. Metal railings rusted at the edges. It had the stillness of a place abandoned not in panic, but in paperwork, forgotten rather than destroyed. Daniel stood at the threshold without touching the door. 30 years, perhaps more, since anyone had cared about what happened inside. He did not force entry that day. He only circled the perimeter, noting a sealed equipment room and a narrow antenna mast, bent but intact. Something about the place felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short. He returned to his cabin before dusk, thoughtful and silent. That night, thunder cracked again, but he did not startle as violently. There was a direction now, a task. He packed more deliberately. Tools, extension cables, a small portable generator he had rebuilt from spare parts over the years. If the station still held instruments, perhaps it still held answers. At first light, with mist rising from the soaked earth, Daniel closed the cabin door behind him. Max trotted ahead with quiet certainty. Together, they walked back toward the abandoned station, toward whatever waited inside. Morning light filtered through cracked window panes as Daniel pushed open the swollen metal door of the abandoned hydrological station. The air inside smelled of dust, old paper, and rusted wiring. Max stepped in first, nose low, paws silent on the concrete floor, ears slightly angled forward, but not tense. The main control room had been stripped of obvious valuables decades ago, yet the structure itself remained intact. Sturdy federal construction built to endure weather more than time. Daniel moved methodically, scanning corners, checking for structural weakness. He found the technical chamber at the rear, sealed behind a heavier insulated door. The hinges groaned, but held. Inside, metal cabinets lined the walls, and at the center stood a dormant monitoring console wired to a rack-mounted storage unit protected behind a plexiglass shield. It looked untouched, preserved not by care, but by neglect. Daniel set down the small portable generator he had rebuilt years earlier from discarded engine parts. His hands moved with practiced precision, connecting cables, grounding lines, checking voltage stability. When he pulled the starter cord, the engine sputtered once, then steadied into a low mechanical hum. Lights flickered, then glowed faintly across the console. The system took longer than expected to respond, old circuits warming reluctantly after decades of silence. There was no password prompt, no authentication barrier. The terminal booted directly into an archival index. Either security protocols had expired long ago, or the station had never been classified beyond administrative research. Daniel did not smile, but something shifted in his posture. Purpose replacing hesitation. Max settled near the doorway, amber eyes watching both Daniel and the corridor beyond. The archived files were labeled by year, water sampling intervals, chemical composition metrics. Daniel navigated slowly, careful not to corrupt anything. He had never considered himself a technician, but discipline translates across fields. Patience is a universal language. One folder dated 30 years earlier drew his attention, flagged repeatedly with internal review notes. He opened a sequence of recorded logs and found an audio file attached. Static crackled before a man's voice emerged, measured, tired, but steady. The recording identified the speaker as Dr. Leonard Hale, senior hydrologist. Daniel pictured him instinctively, a man perhaps in his late 50s at the time, lean from fieldwork rather than gym routines, wire-framed glasses sliding down a narrow nose, gray hair thinning at the temples, hands stained faintly by soil samples. The voice carried neither panic nor drama, only methodical concern. Dr. Hale described detecting low-level traces of industrial solvents downstream from a manufacturing facility several miles away. At the time of the recording, concentrations remained within legal safety limits. However, he emphasized a consistent upward trend across quarterly measurements. "The risk is not immediate," the voice stated, calm but firm, "but trajectory suggests potential exceedance within future operational expansions." Daniel replayed that sentence twice. There was no accusation in it, no alarmism, only data speaking through a careful mind. Hale requested long-term monitoring funding and recommended establishing predictive modeling before approving any industrial growth. The file included attached reports, charts showing incremental increases, barely visible to the untrained eye, but undeniable when viewed across years. Scrolling further, Daniel found internal responses. Budget constraints, insufficient evidence of imminent harm, reallocation of federal funds. A final memo indicated Dr. Hale had been reassigned to a regional office pending further review. No follow-up entries appeared after that date. The station's funding was marked as discontinued. Operational status changed to suspended, later to archived. Daniel leaned back slowly in the metal chair, its legs scraping the floor with a sharp echo. He imagined Hale, dedicated, possibly stubborn, perhaps known among colleagues as overly cautious. Men like that often make institutions uncomfortable. There was no record of scandal, no record of error, just silence after insistence. Max rose and moved closer when Daniel's breathing grew shallow. Not from fear this time, but from recognition. Daniel knew what it meant to raise concerns that others found inconvenient. In another life, he had filed reports about equipment vulnerabilities overseas that were dismissed as non-critical. Months later, those weaknesses cost lives. Institutions rarely respond to what might happen. They respond to what has already happened. The parallel unsettled him more than the rain had. He returned to the data tables and compared the last archived measurements to recent automated logs that had quietly continued through remote sensors powered by a small auxiliary line still functional in the grid. The trend line did not disappear after Hale left. It flattened briefly, then resumed a gradual climb. Daniel did not rush. He copied numerical summaries onto a notepad, verifying units, timestamps, calibration references. The chemicals listed were not catastrophic agents. They were compounds used in cleaning and degreasing industrial equipment. Individually, within limits, acceptable. Accumulated, potentially dangerous. 30 years of marginal increases can hide inside legality. He found no evidence of deliberate tampering, no smoking gun, only neglect and projection. When he removed his hands from the keyboard, the generator's hum seemed louder in the quiet room. The voice of Leonard Hale lingered in his memory, not as a hero, but as a man who had seen a slope before others noticed the incline. Daniel shut down the console carefully, ensuring nothing was altered beyond access logs. The data remained in place, undisturbed except for his observation. He stood in the doorway of the technical chamber and looked once more at the silent equipment. 30 years earlier, someone had asked for long-term monitoring. 30 years later, the monitoring had continued without advocacy. Max waited outside, tail low but relaxed. Daniel stepped back into the corridor and closed the insulated door behind him. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been left unattended. He would need to return with more storage capacity. For now, he had heard enough. Daniel returned to the station before noon, carrying a compact external drive wrapped in oilcloth and a longer extension cable coiled over his shoulder. The forest felt different now, not hostile, but aware. Inside the technical chamber, he powered the console again, listening to the generator settle into its steady rhythm. Max lay across the doorway, head lifted, eyes alert, but calm. Daniel reopened the archive folders and overlaid the last logged data from 30 years ago with the automated entries still trickling in from remote sensors. The numbers confirmed what the voice of Leonard Hale had implied. No dramatic spike, no red line breach, just a slow, disciplined climb. Increment by increment, quarter by quarter. Daniel traced the trend with a pencil on graph paper, jaw set, his light stubble catching the low glow of the monitor. He began the backup carefully, selecting entire directories to ensure context remained intact. Raw samples, calibration notes, internal memos. The transfer bar crawled across the screen. Halfway through deeper archive directories, a small notification window flashed in the upper corner of the monitor. Archive access recorded. It was not a warning, merely a system note, clinical and unadorned. Daniel froze for a second, then leaned closer. In the metadata panel, he noticed a network status line. Legacy remote synchronization. Active. The station, though abandoned, still pinged periodic updates to a central environmental review server. With the nearby manufacturing facility currently petitioning for expansion permits, all historical hydrological data had likely been placed under passive monitoring. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't a hack, it wasn't illegal access, but it wasn't invisible either. Several miles away, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking a modest industrial complex, a notification appeared on a compliance dashboard. Thomas Avery, Director of Environmental Operations, noticed it first. Avery was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered but slightly stooped from long hours at a desk. His dark hair was trimmed short and precise, a faint scar running along his chin from a teenage accident that had given his face a permanent sharpness. Clean-shaven, controlled in expression, he had built his career on risk mitigation rather than confrontation. He wasn't cruel, he was pragmatic. The alert showed that archived federal hydrological data tied to their watershed had been accessed. He tapped the screen twice, eyes narrowing not in panic, but in calculation. Who would be digging through a suspended station file? He murmured. His assistant, Maya Chen, a woman in her early 30s with straight black hair, tied neatly at the nape and a posture that suggested relentless efficiency, checked the timestamp and confirmed the coordinates. The old station. Back at the forest outpost, Daniel understood the implication without needing names or faces. The message meant oversight still existed somewhere in the system. He imagined a server quietly logging anomalies, algorithms flagging deviations from expected dormancy. He glanced at Max, who had risen now, sensing a subtle shift in Daniel's breathing. "We're not alone anymore," Daniel said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. He looked at the transfer progress, only 30% complete. If he continued full duplication, he might leave a longer digital footprint. Institutions respond faster to patterns than to single events. A long access session could escalate interest. Daniel canceled the bulk transfer and navigated back to the trend summaries. Instead of copying everything, he extracted the core data sets, the 30-year chemical concentration series, quarterly reports, and Hale's final predictive model request. These files were compact but decisive. They showed continuity, trajectory, context. He verified checksums to ensure integrity, then encrypted the drive with a simple offline protocol he had learned years ago to protect field notes overseas. He was not stealing, he was preserving. There is a difference, he told himself. Meanwhile, Avery instructed Maya to request a discreet field verification. "No escalation," he said calmly. "Just confirm why the station is active." He disliked surprises, especially ones tied to environmental audits during expansion proposals. Maya nodded, already drafting an internal memo. Neither of them assumed sabotage, they assumed liability. In regulated industries, perception often precedes penalty. Daniel shut down the console and wiped condensation from the monitor's edge with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. He did not erase logs. That would draw suspicion. He simply reduced his footprint. Outside, the forest had gone quiet in that peculiar way it does before dusk. He stepped out of the chamber and locked the outer door loosely behind him, not to keep anyone out, but to buy seconds if someone came. Max fell into stride beside him as they began the walk back through the trees. The data now rested in Daniel's pack, small and silent. He understood one thing clearly. Whatever happened next would not remain private. He had touched a system that still listened. Daniel was tightening a loose conduit along the wall when Max's head lifted before any sound reached human ears. The dog's body went still, ears angled forward, amber eyes fixed toward the tree line beyond the cracked window. Seconds later, the low crunch of tires on wet gravel drifted in. Daniel did not rush. He wiped his hands on a cloth, stepped outside the technical chamber, and waited near the station entrance. A dark utility SUV stopped in the clearing, engine idling briefly before shutting off. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out with the deliberate ease of someone accustomed to being watched. He was tall, perhaps early 50s, with broad shoulders and a controlled posture. His hair, steel gray and combed neatly back, contrasted with a square jaw edged by carefully trimmed salt and pepper stubble. He wore a weatherproof field jacket over a collared shirt, boots too clean for a logger, but practical enough for mud. His name, as he introduced himself, was Richard Cole, Regional Compliance Liaison. Richard's voice was calm, low, and unhurried, the kind that avoided escalation by design. Years earlier, a workplace accident at another facility under his oversight had nearly ended his career. Since then, he had developed an aversion to surprises. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He preferred controlled conversations that reduced variables before they multiplied. His eyes flicked once toward Max, assessing the dog's stance, then returned to Daniel's face. "I understand this station's been inactive for decades," he said evenly. "May I ask how you came across it?" Daniel stood tall but relaxed, flannel shirt damp at the cuffs, hair slightly wind-tossed. "Landslide upstream," he replied. "My water source shifted. I followed the line." He offered no additional information. Richard glanced past him, noting the faint hum of a portable generator within. His gaze lingered on the technical room door, half open, cables visible along the floor. "You've restored power," he observed without accusation. Daniel nodded once. "Enough to check if the equipment still functions." There was no defiance in his tone, only practicality. The station, legally federal property, was not under active company control. Richard knew he had no immediate authority to remove Daniel without formal coordination, and forcing the issue would raise unnecessary attention. He stepped carefully around a broken railing, boots pressing into wet soil. "We're currently reviewing environmental data related to nearby operations," he said. "Access to archived records has been noted." Daniel felt the sentence settle between them like mist. So it was confirmed. He kept his expression neutral, the discipline of years tightening his features. "I haven't altered anything," he answered. It was the truth. Richard studied him, not the posture of a vandal, not the restlessness of a trespasser seeking shelter. There was method in Daniel's movements, restraint in his words. Max remained at Daniel's side, silent but unmistakably present, the dog's broad chest and silver-gray coat a quiet warning without aggression. Richard respected that kind of composure. He had seen recklessness before. This was not it. "I'm not here to escalate," Richard said finally. "Only to understand." He stepped back toward the vehicle, rainwater dripping from the trees in slow intervals. "Federal land complicates jurisdiction. We'll coordinate appropriately." It was not a threat nor reassurance, simply acknowledgement of process. He did not ask directly what Daniel had accessed, nor did Daniel volunteer it. The exchange remained deliberately incomplete. As Richard drove away, the tires left shallow tracks in the mud that would vanish with the next rainfall. Later that afternoon, in a subdued conference room at the plant, Richard briefed Thomas Avery. Avery listened without visible reaction, fingers interlaced on the table. The archived file access, combined with an unknown civilian presence at the station, introduced risk. Not proof of wrongdoing, risk of scrutiny. "Do we know what was copied?" Avery asked. Richard shook his head. "No indication of full extraction. Logs show limited duration." That uncertainty weighed more heavily than confirmation would have. If the 30-year trend analysis surfaced publicly during expansion review, regulatory delay could stretch indefinitely. They did not speak of suppressing data. They spoke of timing, optics, compliance exposure. Back in the forest, Daniel shut down the generator before dusk. He did not rush to move the equipment. Haste invites attention. Instead, he walked a slow perimeter check with Max, memorizing paths, noting where tire marks cut through moss. He understood now that silence had ended. Someone had seen the light inside the station, and someone had cared enough to come. He rested his palm briefly against the cold metal of the technical door before closing it. He would need to proceed carefully. The visit had confirmed one thing: what lay inside this building mattered beyond his own need for water. The storm returned without warning, rolling over the forest in sheets of cold rain that flattened the undergrowth and turned the clearing into mud. Wind pressed hard against the station walls, and thunder fractured the sky in violent intervals. Daniel had chosen to remain inside that evening, not out of defiance, but calculation. If someone came again, they would choose weather that discouraged witnesses. Max sensed it before the first unnatural sound, before the engine cut in the distance, before boots met gravel. The dog rose silently, silver-gray fur bristling along his shoulders, amber eyes fixed toward the darkened entrance. The generator's low hum masked the initial approach. Daniel was reviewing sensor calibration logs when the outer door shuddered under sudden force. Metal groaned, hinges snapped, the generator sputtered as the power line was severed from outside. Darkness swallowed the technical chamber except for the faint spill of lightning through cracked windows. For half a second, Daniel's breath stopped. Thunder detonated above the roof, and the sound became something else in his mind. Artillery echoing across dry terrain, shouted commands, sand and smoke. His muscles locked before reason returned. He was no longer in a forest. He was in memory. Max broke that paralysis. The dog moved forward, not reckless but decisive, placing himself between Daniel and the doorway as silhouettes entered against flashes of lightning. Two men, both in rain gear and gloves, faces partially obscured. They carried tool cases rather than weapons. Professionals, not vandals. The first intruder was shorter and compact, movements efficient. The second, taller, broad-backed, with a beard visible beneath his hood. Their focus was immediate: the equipment rack, the storage unit behind plexiglass. They did not speak Daniel's name. They did not need to. Daniel's training returned in fragments: assess, reposition, reduce advantage. He stepped sideways rather than backward, forcing them to account for him. "Federal property," he said sharply, voice steady despite the residual tremor in his hands. "You're committing a felony." The taller man hesitated only a fraction, but it was enough to confirm they had not expected confrontation inside. The shorter one moved toward the rack, attempting to pry the plexiglass shield loose. Metal screeched under strain. Max lunged, not to attack, but to intercept, slamming his weight against the man's forearm. The tool clattered across the concrete floor. The man recoiled, swearing under his breath. In the confusion, lightning illuminated the room again, revealing Daniel fully upright, shoulders squared, not retreating. The storm intensified, rain driving sideways through broken panels. The men reassessed quickly. They were equipped for removal, not violence. Any escalation, injury, police report, federal charges would multiply risk beyond containment. The taller intruder stepped back first, pulling his partner with him. "This isn't worth it," he muttered, barely audible over the storm. They abandoned the attempt, retreating into darkness as swiftly as they had entered. The SUV engine roared to life and faded down the soaked access road. For several seconds, Daniel remained still, breath uneven but stabilizing. Max stood pressed against his leg, chest heaving, one hind paw lifted awkwardly. Daniel crouched immediately, running careful hands along the dog's body. A shallow cut along the flank, likely from broken metal. No fracture, no deep tear. "You're all right," he murmured, voice low, grounding himself as much as the dog. He tore a strip from an old undershirt and wrapped the wound tightly but gently. Outside, thunder continued to roll, but it no longer sounded like artillery, just weather. The storage unit remained bolted in place. The plexiglass shield bore scratches, but the drive had not been removed. Daniel stood and surveyed the damage, broken hinges, severed cable, mud tracked across the floor. The attempt had been precise, targeted, unfinished. They had come for the original source, not the building. He understood now that discretion had limits. Someone believed the physical drive mattered enough to risk entry. That belief alone validated the weight of the data. When the rain softened to a steady drizzle, Daniel secured the damaged door as best he could and shut down what remained of the temporary setup. He did not chase them. He did not call authorities yet. Instead, he looked once more at the intact storage unit, then at Max resting despite the bandage. The original drive was still there. They had failed. And that failure meant the next move would have to be his. Morning came pale and washed clean after the storm, the forest breathing in long, quiet drafts of mist. Daniel did not linger. He repaired what he could at the station, replaced the severed cable, reinforced the outer door with salvaged brackets, then completed the full archival copy he had interrupted days earlier. This time he worked without hesitation, duplicating raw data sets, calibration notes, and Hale's original projections. The generator ran steady. Max lay beside him, bandaged flank visible but healing, eyes alert whenever branches cracked outside. When the final progress bar reached completion, Daniel disconnected the drive and sealed it inside a waterproof case. He knew the data alone meant nothing unless verified by someone whose credibility outweighed his own. He drove the old pickup he kept hidden along a Forest Service road into the nearest town with a reliable signal. The truck was faded blue, older than many of the buildings on Main Street, its bench seat patched with duct tape and patience. Daniel contacted an independent environmental laboratory listed in state records, Riverside Analytical. Dr. Elena Morales answered the inquiry 2 days later via secure call. She was in her early 40s, slender and sharp-featured, with olive-toned skin and dark hair pulled into a low bun, streaked faintly with silver at the temples. Her eyes were precise, analytical, even when she smiled, which she did rarely. Years earlier, she had testified in a contamination case that cost her a university partnership but earned her a reputation for uncompromising methodology. "Send full data sets," she said evenly. "Not summaries, not screenshots, full context." Daniel respected that immediately. He also reached out to a journalist whose name appeared repeatedly in investigative environmental reporting, Aaron Whitaker. Whitaker was tall and narrow-shouldered, with sandy hair that refused discipline and a beard kept more from neglect than fashion. His voice carried the mild impatience of someone accustomed to being dismissed until proven right. A factory spill in his hometown during childhood had displaced his family for months. Since then, he pursued industrial accountability with relentless focus. When Daniel outlined only the essentials, 30-year trend, archived hydrological station, attempted equipment removal. Whitaker did not dramatize. "If the numbers hold," he said, "the story writes itself. But we verify first." Daniel agreed. Sensationalism would destroy credibility. Riverside Analytical completed their independent modeling within the week. The report was clinical, dense with tables and projections. Current chemical concentrations remained within regulatory limits. No immediate hazard to drinking water. However, longitudinal modeling based on historical trend lines showed statistically significant incremental growth correlated with production increases at the manufacturing facility. Projected expansion scenarios suggested that within 3 to 5 years, concentrations would likely exceed permissible thresholds if mitigation systems were not upgraded. Dr. Morales's concluding statement was restrained. While presently compliant, expansion without infrastructure modification introduces high probability of future non-compliance. It was not an accusation, it was mathematics. Whitaker reviewed the report alongside state environmental statutes governing expansion permits. Under state review policy, demonstrated long-term upward contaminant trends, particularly when supported by archived federal data, required suspension of expansion approval pending comprehensive reassessment. He drafted a preliminary inquiry to the State Department of Environmental Quality. Within days, regulatory officials initiated a formal review process. The plant's expansion application was placed on temporary hold. No headlines yet, no scandal, just procedure activating in response to documented risk. Daniel read the lab report twice inside his cabin, light filtering through damp pine needles outside. He felt no triumph, only steadiness. The chemicals were not poison in the present. They were warning signs in motion. That distinction mattered. Max rested at his feet, tail thumping lightly whenever Daniel shifted. The dog's wound had closed cleanly. In the quiet of the evening, Daniel listened to the stream near his cabin. It ran clearer now as sediment from the landslide settled. The water was not healed from contamination. It had never crossed that line. But the future of it had shifted. A week later, a certified notice was delivered to the manufacturing facility. Expansion approval suspended pending environmental reassessment and required infrastructure upgrades. The state had entered the matter formally. Daniel folded the printed confirmation from Whitaker and placed it beside Hale's archived transcript. 30 years earlier, a voice had asked for monitoring. Now, the monitoring had spoken. The data had been confirmed. The process had begun. The forest did not celebrate. It simply continued breathing. Morning fog lifted slowly from the treetops as a pair of state vehicles rolled carefully into the clearing outside the hydrological station. Daniel stood a few yards back, arms folded loosely, watching without intrusion. Max remained beside him, silver-gray coat bright against the damp earth, the earlier wound now nothing more than a faint line beneath healed fur. The officials moved with procedural calm rather than urgency. Leading them was Deputy Commissioner Harold Gaines, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a weathered face and close-cropped white hair. His handshake, when offered, was firm but measured. Years in public service had carved patience into his demeanor. An early career wildfire response had taught him that overreaction often causes more damage than the initial spark. He spoke in deliberate sentences, careful to avoid drama. "We're here to document and secure," he said. "Nothing more." The original storage unit was removed under formal chain of custody documentation. Photographs were taken, serial numbers logged, seals applied in Daniel's presence. No one accused him of trespassing. No one praised him either. The data had already been transferred through official channels, verified independently, and entered into the state's Environmental Review Archive. The station itself, once abandoned and silent, was reclassified as an active monitoring point. Technicians replaced corroded sensors, installed updated remote telemetry, and reinforced the technical chamber door properly this time. The work was methodical, almost quiet in its competence. It felt less like victory and more like maintenance, exactly what Leonard Hale had once requested. At the manufacturing facility several miles away, expansion permits were formally suspended pending infrastructure upgrades. Internal engineering teams began redesigning filtration systems to handle projected output increases. Thomas Avery signed the compliance adjustment plan without protest. He understood the mathematics. Richard Cole attended the regulatory meeting with restrained composure. Neither man looked defeated. They looked recalibrated. Publicly, the company issued a statement affirming commitment to environmental responsibility. Privately, the cost of delay was calculated in spreadsheets and timelines, not resentment. Back at the cabin, Daniel noticed the stream first by sound. The harsh, unsettled rush that had followed the landslide softened into a clearer rhythm. Sediment gradually settled downstream, leaving the water brighter against smooth stones. He knelt and cupped it in his palm. No metallic scent, no unnatural sheen. It had never been poisoned. It had only been at risk. That distinction mattered deeply to him. Prevention carries less applause than rescue, but it spares the need for apology. Max drank first, lifting his head afterward with quiet satisfaction, droplets clinging to his muzzle. A week later, Deputy Commissioner Gaines returned alone, this time without convoy. He approached the cabin on foot, boots respectful of the earth. "The station's being staffed part-time," he informed Daniel. "We could use someone familiar with the terrain to report irregularities." It was not an offer dressed as charity. It was a practical invitation. Daniel considered it. He had not sought recognition, and he did not crave authority. But the idea of remaining close to the place where silence had once buried warning felt different now. "I'll keep an eye on it," he said simply. Gaines nodded, satisfied. That evening, rain fell again, gentler this time, a steady curtain instead of artillery. Daniel sat just inside the doorway of his cabin, boots off, flannel sleeves rolled. The thunder rolled distant and muted, and though his body stiffened instinctively, it did not seize him. He breathed through it. Max lay stretched across the threshold, chin on paws, amber eyes half closed, yet aware. The forest no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like stewardship. Daniel did not see himself as a hero. He had not exposed corruption, toppled executives, or ignited outrage. He had simply listened to a voice 30 years old and refused to let it vanish again. The difference between disaster and stability had been measured not in explosions, but in decimals on a chart. Somewhere upstream, water continued its patient ascent toward the valley, unremarkable and clear. Nothing catastrophic had happened. That was the point. The warning had been heard in time. Max shifted slightly in his sleep. The stream kept moving. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as fire from the sky, but as quiet warnings we choose to hear. Perhaps God does not always stop the storm. He sends someone willing to listen before it is too late. If this story moved you, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless you and your loved ones with protection and peace.